challenger Chris Vance.
This week on Q&A, author J.D. Vance. Mr. Vance discusses his best-selling book, Hillbilly Elegy, a memoir of a family and culture in crisis.
J.D. Vance, did you have any idea when you wrote this book that it would be a huge bestseller, Hillbilly Elegy?
No, I didn't. I definitely didn't expect it to have quite the response that it's had.
Why do you think it has?
Well, a couple of things. So one, I think just the weird nature of the election this year has caused a lot of people to ask, who are these white working class voters that are often supporting Donald Trump, but just seem to be making waves in this election in a number of different ways. And I think second, I've shed a light on an area of the country that partially because of the election, but partially just because people are curious. I've shed a light on an area of the country that they didn't know a whole lot about. So hopefully I've shown them a little bit about what folks in this region of the world are like, the good and the bad.
Where were you born?
So I was born in southern Ohio, a steel town called Middletown, Ohio, which we always said it was Middletown because it was in between Cincinnati and Dayton, and that was the most impressive thing about it. But spent a lot of time in eastern Kentucky because my grandparents, who I grew up with, were kind of Appalachian diaspora. So they came from eastern Kentucky coal country, worked in southern Ohio steel mills, which is a story that's pretty common in that area.
Can you paint a picture of Middletown and Jackson, Kentucky?
Sure. So Jackson, Kentucky is just a pretty small, got about 6,000 people in it, pretty impoverished, 30 to 40% poverty rates. The opioid epidemic has really hit Jackson hard, and so that's a big part of what's going on in these areas. Not a whole lot of people working. Obviously, the loss of coal jobs has hit this area pretty hard. So in some ways, it's a pretty tough area to grow up in. Middletown is, in some ways, it was supposed to be the economic savior, and in a lot of ways it was, because it brought my grandparents from eastern Kentucky, provided them a good wage. But a lot of the problems that they thought they were escaping in Jackson have just presented themselves in Middletown, Ohio, too. So you see a lot of the same problems that exist in Jackson, from the family breakdown to the heroin epidemic to the joblessness that's now pretty characteristic of this area of the country. I wouldn't say it's quite as destitute, just because there is still a lot going on in southwestern Ohio, so folks are still able to find decent jobs. The poverty rate isn't quite as high, the unemployment rate isn't quite as high, but it's, for folks like us, it's pretty similar, right? A lot of the social ills that exist in southern Ohio don't look that much different from the ones that exist in Jackson. Your book is Hillbilly Elegy. Are there hills there in both those places? There are, though they're a lot bigger in Jackson. Yeah, so Jackson is right in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. Middletown is probably technically just outside of the Appalachian Mountains, maybe in what's called the Appalachian Plateau. So, if you've ever been to Cincinnati, which is the closest big city to Middletown, very hilly, almost mountainous, but not anything like the true hills of Kentucky and Tennessee. What year did you leave that area permanently? Well, you mean Middletown? That whole Middletown or Jackson. Yeah, so I left in 2003, and I left like a lot of kids, even one on my block, joining the military. So I enlisted in the Marines, and this is right after actually we invaded Iraq. I enlisted in April of 03, and I believe we invaded in March of 03. And so, left, went to the Marine Corps, spent a lot of time in North Carolina, did a tour in Iraq, but really that was the engine that brought me out of where I grew up. And I, besides going back to visit family, I haven't really lived there for more than, a few months at a time. What years were you in the Marine Corps? I was in from 03 to 07, so I did a 4-year tour in the Marines. What years were you at Ohio State University? 07 to 09, so left straight from the Marines, went to Ohio State for a couple years. And what was your major there? Majored political science and philosophy at Ohio State. What years were you at Yale Law School? That was 2010 to 2013. So went pretty much straight from Ohio State to Yale Law School. Had about 9 months where, just because I graduated in late summer from Ohio State, I couldn't start. The next law school term had already started. So I went, and that was actually the biggest chunk of time that I lived in Middletown since I left. I went and stayed with my aunt and uncle. What year did you move to San Francisco? 2015. So about a year and a half ago. And what law firm are you in, and what kind of law do you practice? So I'm actually an investor in San Francisco. So I practice law in D.C. at a firm called Sidley Austin, Chicago-based firm. They've got a big D.C. office. So did a lot of regulatory work in D.C. and then actually left to go and work in the technology world in San Francisco. So I've ran a company for a short time and now am at an investment firm.
What year did you get married?
Got married 2014.
Do you have children?
No kids. 2 very large dogs, but no kids.
Where is your mother?
So my mom still lives, like a lot of my family, back in Middletown, Ohio. So that's where my aunt lives, where my sister lives. And so that's still, where most of my family is. So I have a fair amount of family back in Eastern Kentucky, too.
Has your mother read this book?
She has. Yeah, she has. And, it's tough, right? It's not necessarily the most flattering. It's the sort of thing that, when Mom and I talked about it for the first time, it was a few weeks ago, actually, that we really talked about the book and what was in it and the story that it told. It was one of the best conversations that I had with Mom probably in 15 years, just because it's hard for Mom, I think, to recognize the way that not just her life affected me and my sister, but the way that her parents' life affected her. When you grow up like this, I think you grow up pretty guilty. You think that a lot of these things are your fault. And one of the things I tried to do in the book that hopefully I did an okay job of is trying to put this in a multi-generational context that try to explain that this wasn't all, some of the problems that I had growing up weren't all Mom's fault. They were in some ways the inheritance of a family that was just as hard on her as it was on me.
How much did alcohol play in your mother's life, and drugs for that matter?
Well, in Mom's life, alcohol wasn't as big of a story, except for her dad was an alcoholic, and that obviously impacted her in a lot of ways. He quit drinking right around the time I was born, so it's really weird that I think of my grandpa as this almost perfect guy, never had a temper, never did anything bad, but he was a pretty mean drunk before I was born. So it's always interesting to see that juxtaposition and to talk to family who knew him then, and of course to compare that with the opinion that I had of him growing up. Drugs was a really big part of Mom's life and a really big part of our family's story. She, like a lot of people in this region of the world, caught a taste for prescription narcotics. It's something that really dominated our life in a lot of different ways. It affected our life in a lot of different ways. And it's something that, I'm proud to say and happy to say that she's gotten under control and things are going pretty well right now. But that's just, it's a story that's unfortunately all too common, where drugs move in and really mess up these families in a lot of different ways.
What's the story of when she tried to commit suicide in a car?
Yeah, well, so this was when I was maybe 10 or 11. She had recently lost her job. I didn't know it at the time, but I believe that was really when she started to use drugs. And her marriage was falling apart. We were living in a very rural part of the state, but we're deciding, I think, to move back a little bit closer to Middletown, which isn't exactly urban, but is a lot more than just a street light. Let's say that. And she crashed a car into a telephone pole. She went to the hospital, and what she said is that she had tried to commit suicide, which of course was very hard for us to hear, very hard for me to hear as her son. You always wonder when things like that happen, what could I have done differently? I think you wonder that if you're a grown man or if you're just a 10 or 11-year-old kid, and that's a big part of just growing up in that environment. You're always wondering what could I have done to make things a little bit better, and that never really leaves you.
How old are you?
32 now, just turned 32.
How old is your mother?
So that'd make her 55.
And I've got a string of names here. I want to ask you about each one of them.
Sure.
Bob, Chip, Steve, Matt, and Ken. Let's start with Bob. Who was Bob?
So Bob was a stepfather that I had. It was Mom's third husband, and Bob was actually my legal father and still is. So what happened is that when I was 5 or 6 years old, my biological father decided that he was going to give me up for adoption, very complicated reasons, and he and I are very close now, so we've reconnected. But Bob, who was Mom's husband at the time, is the person who was there when my biological father wanted to give me up, and so he became my legal father. I took his name. I became James David Hamill, which you'll notice is not my name anymore. And he was around for a couple of years, but like a lot of the men that we were exposed to at that phase in our lives, he didn't stick around. he didn't become my dad. He became just another guy who kind of came into the picture and then left after a couple years.
Who was Chip?
Chip was one of Mom's boyfriends. She stayed with Chip for a little while, lived together for about a year and a half, I would say. And he was, a reasonable guy. He was a sort of classic, he worked as a police officer, and he had a lot of the attitudes that were common in this area. I believe that he had some connection to the South just because of his mannerisms and the way that he conducted himself. Was a nice guy, drank a lot, maybe, wasn't abusive in any way towards me, but, the real story of a lot of these guys is that they would come in and they would go out. It's not that they were bad guys in and of themselves, it's just that they were, not the sort of folks that you could really depend upon, and that was the lesson that we grew up with when we were kids, is that you couldn't really depend on these guys.
Who was Steve?
Steve was the boyfriend who came after Chip. Again, he was a really nice guy. My sister and I always said that we wanted Mom to marry Steve because he was so good to us, but after about a year, he was gone.
Who was Matt?
Matt was probably my favorite of all of my stepdads or Mom's boyfriends. He was a younger guy, really, really good human being, cared a lot about me and my sister. And during the worst part in our lives, which is when Mom's addiction problem landed her in rehab, Matt was the person who took care of us in a lot of ways. He checked in on us. He made sure that we had food to eat, that we were getting our homework done, and that we were going to school when there wasn't really a significant adult presence in our lives. And Matt and I are still keep in contact, actually. So they, Mom and Matt broke it off after a few years, but he and I are still pretty close, and he's doing well, and I'm happy that we're still keeping in touch.
Ken.
So Ken is an interesting story. Interesting, maybe not the right word, but I was living with Mom and Matt, and I came home one day, and Mom told me that she was getting married, and I figured that she was getting married to Matt, but she was actually getting married to this man I had never met before, Ken, who was her boss. And what I learned is that she had started a relationship with Ken, and that we'd be moving in with him, and so they had been dating for about a week. And I was moved from Matt's house, who I really liked, to Ken's house. Ken, again, was perfectly nice guy, wasn't abusive in any way, but just was one of these people who by then I had learned would kind of come into our lives and then would go.
How many times did your mom get married?
She'd been married 5 times over the course of my, 4 times over the course of my life, 5 times over the course of hers.
Is she married now?
It's a good question. I believe the answer is no.
And what does she do for a living?
So she works as, I believe that she takes care of elderly folks. So she works in various, she's basically a home health nurse is what I understand that she does, which is, good for her because she's clean and she's working hard.
Who was Mama?
So Mama was the matriarch of our family and in a lot of ways the savior of my own life. So Mama was my mom's mom, and which is pretty common in these big Eastern Kentucky Appalachian families. Her reach was maybe broader than a lot of people's grandparents were. So she was the person who made sure that I had a safe and stable home when my mom couldn't provide it. She was the person who made sure that I had, I think, exposure to a lot of the life lessons and the people that I needed to have exposure to so that I didn't completely fall through the cracks. And, she was this gun-toting, she had 19 handguns when she died. She cussed up a storm. She was not this sort of stay-at-home and knit you a sweater sort of grandmother, but she was this very powerful and perceptive figure and made sure that I had, again, exposure to the things that I needed to have exposure to have a good life.
Papa.
Papa was Mama's husband, and even though because of his drinking they were separated, they didn't live in the same house, they never got divorced. I think they just didn't really believe in it. So Papa was, really, we just kind of went through the revolving door of maternal partners. Papa was the one man in our life that we really could depend on. When he died, I stood up in the funeral home and said that he was the best father that anybody could ask for, because for me and my sister, he was the person who played that role in our lives. He was the person who fixed up a car or who maybe provided us a little extra spending money. That was his role in our lives. He really stood in for the father that my sister and I didn't have in different ways, and was just, again, was this sort of gruff old guy from Eastern Kentucky. He didn't really, in some ways, fit in Southern Ohio. He definitely belonged in Eastern Kentucky and felt more comfortable there, but was just this great guy.
What is Mountain Dew mouth?
So Mountain Dew mouth is a term that people give to the dental problems that happen when you drink too much sugary soda. And it's not something that folks like to talk about. I think in a lot of ways people are unfairly stereotyped for having terrible teeth in this region of the country. But it is true that among a lot of the poor families, kids start to have dental problems very early because they're fed sugary soda, they're given sugary soda long before they should be. So I was, I believe, a baby when Pepsi was first put into my bottle, and my grandma, Mamaw, said, "Stop doing that, you can't do that, you're going to rot this kid's teeth out." But it just goes to show that a lot of us didn't know what we were supposed to do. We didn't know the behaviors and the attitudes that we should have to prevent premature dental problems. It's not like the people who put Pepsi in my bottle were bad people. They just didn't really know that was going to have long-term health consequences. Luckily, my grandma did.
What's a hillbilly and what is an elegy?
So a hillbilly is someone I define as someone who has a connection to Appalachia, or if you're from south of the Ohio, they say Appalachia. And it's, either you have family there, or you're from there yourself, or you have a special kinship towards the people who come from that region. It is a term that is pejorative. It's the sort of term where if an outsider used it, someone from outside of our family, I'd be very offended. But in our family, we use it as a term of endearment. As Mamaw said, nobody can call you a hillbilly except for us. And when we say it, it's okay. An elegy is just, I think of a sad song or a sad poem. And so the book, I called it Hillbilly Elegy because in some ways it's a sad story of people who came from Appalachia. It's the lives that they've led, and why maybe the optimism that my grandparents had when they were, 15, when they were 20 years old, hasn't necessarily panned out in their own family. Why 50 or 60 years later, their family has a lot of the problems that they hoped their family wouldn't have when they escaped from Eastern Kentucky poverty.
Who named the book?
A combination of me and my publisher and agent. It's something that we talked a lot about. It's not something that I was actually especially attached to at first. I thought that it was a little, elegy is not a word that I would have used a lot in my language growing up, and so I wasn't especially attached to it. But the more that I wrote and the more that I thought about what it really meant, the more I recognized that it really was the story of my family, these hillbillies who came from Eastern Kentucky to Southern Ohio, and the sadness that characterized their lives in a lot of ways.
As you sit here talking about this book, there's something missing.
Sure.
I mean, we're not getting what's in this book because why? I mean, there is language in this book that would remove the bark from the tree.
Well, it's full of colorful language because the people that I grew up around use colorful language. So there's a lot of F words, a lot of every other cuss word under the sun. As someone once told me, your mamaw has a mouth like a sailor, only worse. And I don't filter that. I don't try to hide that. That's definitely just the way that we spoke. And so I try to present a pretty honest picture in the book.
What do you think your mamaw and papa would think if they read this book and they're both deceased and now?
Yeah, that's right. I really think that they would love the book. And I tried to write a book that they would be proud of for that reason. Mamaw was very open about the fact that there were problems. She was very, and I say this again and again, that she was very perceptive. She recognized in a lot of ways that people didn't like to talk about these problems. They thought of as you don't want to open up the family history, you don't want to talk about these problems. But she recognized that impulse wasn't necessarily super wise because you had to talk about these problems to really understand them and to hopefully try to fix them. And I think that the people who've come up to me and said that, man, your mamaw is really just a hero, your papaw is a hero, your sister is a hero, I think that's what I really wanted to accomplish in writing this book, is to show people when you grow up in an environment like I did, you need a lot of people to play a sort of heroic role in your life for you to have a chance. And luckily I had that. I had Mama and Papa, I had my aunt, I had my sister, and this is really the story of how they impacted my life in a lot of positive ways.
Where is your sister, Lindsay?
So she's in Middletown too. Yeah, back in Ohio.
Is she married?
She is. Yeah, she's definitely, in our own ways, I think Lindsay and I have each escaped the statistics that said, if you grow up in a home like this, if you grow up in an environment like this, you shouldn't be able to live a happy life. You shouldn't be able to have an intact family or a decent, steady job. And Lindsay and I have both overcome that in our own ways.
I'm going to pull this just out of context. No amount of self-control could withstand a well-played maternal criticism. Quote, "Your mom's so fat that her ass has its own zip code," unquote. Quote, "Your mom's such a hillbilly that her false teeth have cavities," or simply, "Yo mama." What's that about?
Well, what's that about is that family honor and family loyalty are really important when you grow up in a community like this. Maybe it's because you're just a poor kid and you don't have a whole lot else to hang your hat on, but we were taught from the stories that our aunts and uncles told us, to the way that we were encouraged to never let an insult to your family or to your mother go unpunished, that it was really important for you to defend the family honor, that you were part of that family story and you had to play your part. And the point of those insults is that, they're pretty mild insults. They're the sort of thing where if you live in a corporate boardroom, or if you're trying to have a successful 21st century marriage, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to respond to insults with such a hot temper, maybe with fists or violence. But when you grow up in a community like that, when you grow up in a family like mine, you're really taught that that's what you have to do.
You're talking about Bob on one page. He said, however, was a walking hillbilly stereotype. Half of his teeth had rotted out, and the other half were black, brown, and misshapen, the consequence of a lifetime of Mountain Dew consumption and presumably some missed dental checkups. He was a high school dropout who drove a truck for a living. Mm-hmm. How much of, how many others were like that description of Bob?
Not a whole lot that really fit, checked all of these stereotypical boxes. One of the things I try to write about in the book is that a lot of these stereotypes of hillbillies aren't necessarily totally fair, right? And people are justifiably sensitive about being stereotyped as just a dumb redneck. And hopefully that's not the picture that emerges from the portrait that I paint of my own family. So most people were not quite as extreme as Bob. But what I do try to point out in the book is that a lot of these problems that maybe we perceive as stereotypes, they don't exist in everybody. They don't even exist in most people, but they're certainly there. The family chaos, the breakdown, the drug addiction, these problems exist at a disproportionate level in our community, and we got to be open about it if we ever want to change direction.
You can walk through a town where 30% of the young men work fewer than 20 hours a week and find not a single person aware of his own laziness.
Yeah, that's right. The tough thing about these areas is that most of the people who are out of work are really trying to find a good job. They're trying to get ahead. They're trying, they're applying, they're putting out resumes, they're talking to friends and family. And you have to be cognizant that those people exist, and you can't help but to feel bad for them. On the other hand, there are a lot of people in these communities who aren't working and who don't seem to care that they're not working. Now, what's interesting is that they're not aware of it, right? So the people who don't care that they're not working, they don't call themselves lazy. They'll extol the virtues of hard work and industriousness, even as they're very comfortable not working themselves. And the juxtaposition is really tough, right? Because you see these people who are working really hard and trying to get ahead, and then on the other hand, you see the people who aren't working hard, who aren't trying to get ahead. And both of those people exist, and if you live in a community like mine, you can't really miss them. You see both sides of that coin.
This language is strong, and I won't be able to read it all. My sister and I still call the old mail carrier the Chicken Man, and years later even mention of how the city government ganged up on the Chicken Man could inspire Mama's trademark vitriol. Effing zoning laws. They can kiss my ruby red you-know-what.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So the Chicken Man was a guy who, brought he raised chickens just like folks did where he came from. He was also an Eastern Kentucky transplant. He had chickens in his backyard. They laid eggs. He collected the eggs, and when one got old or sick, he'd wring its neck and cut it up for meat. That's just what people did. It's funny that a lot of hipsters and modern Americans are now kind of recreating that life, but back then it was really looked down upon, and it was just one of the many ways in which my grandparents felt that they were outsiders in this new Southern Ohio town. There were the Eastern Kentucky transplants, who maybe a lot of folks called hillbillies or looked down upon. Those were the folks who were like them. But then there were also these relatively upper crust, middle class Ohioans who weren't totally comfortable with people like the Chicken Man moving into their communities and having certain habits and attitudes that came with them.
How often did you see people when you were growing up that were hungry?
Hungry, not a whole lot. Definitely didn't see a ton of extreme poverty. You saw it a little bit back in Jackson. Certainly the adults were aware of it. As a kid, I wasn't necessarily as aware that there were people going hungry, but I remember people talking about it. But in Middletown, even the poor people, even the people who didn't have a lot of money like us, they weren't so destitute that they couldn't afford food. They may be a little bit worried about where the next meal would come from. They were worried about how they might pay for it. But I never got the sense that there were truly desperate, hungry people in the community that I grew up in.
How many were poor?
A big chunk. It's hard to put an exact number on it, and obviously different people mean different things by poor. But I'd say that probably about a quarter of the population of Middletown lived, if not below the poverty line, pretty close to it. So, didn't have a ton of money, maybe worried how they were going to put, clothes on their kids' back, worried about how they were going to pay for school supplies and things like that. So definitely a good chunk of people were poor, were struggling to make it in different ways.
You talk periodically through the book about religion. Mm-hmm. Your own beliefs. You were a believer, not a believer, and people around you were. Give us some background on all that, and how religious is that area?
So it's very religious in self-identification. So if you ask people whether they identify as Christians or not Christians, they'll say, they're evangelical Christians, they're very devout. If you look at actual church attendance rates, people aren't going to church as much, so they'll identify as Christians but not actually have much connection to a traditional brick and mortar religious institution. I think that's really important because, as I write in the book, having connection to that church community, that sense of social support, that sense of moral pressure was really important to me, as there were opportunities to do drugs and engage in a lot of different behaviors that were self-destructive. So having access to that church community for me, which I first got through my dad's church actually when I was a teenager, was really important. And it worries me that in these areas, and I've since re-engaged with my religious faith, it worries me a little bit that you see people who identify as Christian but don't have much connection to an actual church, because I think in a lot of ways you're not getting some of the benefits that come along with your faith if you're not actually engaging with it in that week-to-week way.
What's the Hillbilly Highway?
So Hillbilly Highway is a sort of broad term that captures a lot of roads that brought people from Eastern Kentucky, from West Virginia, from Tennessee into Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and so forth. So broadly, it's just a road. Typically, it's often referred as U.S. Route 23, so this is before the U.S. interstate system. There was a U.S. Route 23 that ran through Eastern Kentucky, I think all the way through Columbus, and there were just a ton of people from Eastern Kentucky, from Tennessee, who were driving along that highway, moving permanently in search for a better, in search of a better life or a better wage. But they're also, what's interesting about it is that was the way that people got back home on the holidays or on the weekends. And so it's the Hillbilly Highway because you're driving in these areas and you see in Eastern Kentucky or Tennessee license plates for Michigan, Indiana, Pennsylvania, Ohio, because that's really the road that these people traveled.
What's the distance between Jackson, Kentucky, and kind of give us an idea where it is, and Middletown, Ohio?
Yeah, so Jackson, Kentucky is in southeastern Kentucky, coal country, a county called Breathitt County. As the crow flies, it's maybe 100, 110 miles. In terms of driving time, it's about 3.5, 4 hours to go from Middletown to Jackson. That's mostly just because the mountain roads, you can't drive that fast on them. They're really hilly, and you go up and you go down, and so it's difficult to really get a good speed. So it feels probably a little bit further away than it actually is. It's the sort of place where you could make a good weekend trip, but it takes a little while to get there.
How do you write about this in the book? How do people game the food stamp system?
Yeah, so there are a couple ways. So this is something I saw when I was a cashier at a local grocery store. So one way people game the food stamp system is that they'll buy large amounts of soda with food stamps and then sell it back to their neighbors at a 60 or 70% cash discount. So that allows them to sort of transfer food stamps into cash benefits. Sometimes they'll sell the food stamps directly, which of course is illegal, but a lot of people still do. And one thing I saw when I was a cashier is that, you know, people will come in and they'll buy a lot of food, a lot of soda with food stamps, but then buy everything else on a separate check. And so there's this recognition, right, that they're not depending maybe on these food stamps in quite the way that was intended. What's interesting about this is that it breeds a sort of resentment, right? It breeds resentment at your neighbors because people see, you know, folks who need this assistance, who rely on it, who don't take advantage of the system, and then they see the people who do take advantage of the system, and so they gain a certain amount of frustration towards those who are gaming the system, and they also gain frustration towards the government that they feel isn't necessarily monitoring these benefits as well as they should. So it's this really interesting feeling where people recognize that this assistance is needed, but also maybe feel a bit ambivalent towards it.
You said that you had an epiphany as a young boy. Do you remember that?
Well, I had a few epiphanies as a young boy. You know, one of those epiphanies is that I sort of recognized that maybe all of the things that folks, meaning especially the government, were trying to do to help communities like mine, maybe the help wasn't necessarily going to the places that it was needed, right? So this is what I write about with folks gaming the welfare system, is you see this recognition, right, that some people are using the system well and they need it and they're honest, and some people aren't using the system maybe as honestly as they should.
You say, I hated school and I hated home more. And when you talk about home, what home are you talking about?
So I'm talking about the home that I had with Mom, where we felt like we were constantly cycling from one boyfriend's place to the next boyfriend's place to the next husband's place. And the reason I really hated that home is that, one, it was pretty unstable, it was pretty chaotic. There was a lot of intense fighting, sometimes even domestic violence directed one direction or the other. But most of all, what I hated was the instability, the feeling that I could never really get safe and comfortable in one place, that I was constantly moving, that you could come home from school one day and find that you were moving from the house that you really liked to a house with a complete stranger. That was what I disliked the most.
About school?
About home. That's what I disliked the most about home.
About school. Why did you hate school?
Yeah, well, in some ways I just didn't see the point of it, right? So there wasn't this clear connection that now exists in my mind between education and opportunities, because even the people who did pretty well in school didn't necessarily make a whole lot out of themselves. You saw so many people not really making or having good opportunities that it was hard to believe that school really mattered that much. And partially the reason I hated it is just because it's hard to go from a home where you're unhappy to school where everything, you know, is sunshine and rainbows, right? The unhappiness that you take with you at home, sometimes you get sick because you're stressed out, because you're worried about going back home at the end of the day. That just discolors and I think shapes the way that you approach school, and it makes you not especially happy to be at school, even if it's better than the home that you came from.
Now that you have a 4-year degree from Ohio State and a law degree from Yale, what do you think of the schools that you went to back in Middletown, Ohio, and I assume other places out there?
Yeah, well, I think that they definitely could do more to help poor kids, but I also don't think that that was primarily the problem of mine growing up, right? If you think about why I wasn't doing well in school, it's because there was so much going on outside of school that it was tough to focus. And so I would like to definitely see our, you know, elementary and high school education focus a little bit more on recognizing the problems that existed in homes like mine and trying to anticipate those problems and maybe counteract them. But I'm also cognizant of the fact that it's really hard for school to totally make up for a negative home life. And the teachers that I had, the school system that I had growing up, it really did try hard in a lot of ways.
What was the relationship between your mama and her daughter, your mother?
It was close, but also pretty chaotic. You know, Mamaw wasn't, as you know, if you've read the book, Mamaw wasn't afraid to share her opinion and wasn't afraid to tell Mom that she disagreed with this or that lifestyle choice. So I think that Mamaw was Mom's best friend, but she wasn't always a best friend that was purely enabling. A lot of times she was the best friend who wasn't afraid to tell Mom what she thought about certain life decisions.
Now that you live in San Francisco and that you lived in New Haven, Connecticut, and you lived in Columbus, Ohio, could you ever go back to the hill country and live there?
I think that I definitely could.
Would you, do you think?
It's hard to imagine going back to a truly rural place just because the opportunities aren't there, right? And that's why so many people like me leave and stay away for so long. It's not because they don't love where they came from. It's still the place where I feel most comfortable in the whole world. It's just hard to imagine what job I'd do. And so a big part of this problem of what we call brain drain isn't that people like me don't like their homes anymore. I love my home. But, you know, you've got to have higher skill, higher wage jobs to really support an economy that has, you know, law school graduates and so forth.
But you tell a story in the book about going back there and having somebody ask you if you go to Yale and you dodged it.
Yeah. Someone at a gas station asked me if I went to Yale, and I remember feeling in that moment like I could identify as this elite Ivy Leaguer and feel like a traitor to my own home and my own family, or I could be a Middletonian, I could be the Southern Ohio boy who belonged, and I decided to be the Southern Ohio boy who belonged, and so I lied to her. I said, no, I don't go to Yale, but my girlfriend does. And the reason I said that actually I think gives an interesting insight into the way that upward mobility and all this relocation creates certain conflicts in our minds, right? I lied to this woman because to tell her the truth I would have felt like a bit of a class traitor. And so it is, you know, I don't want to gloss over the fact that when you go to a place like Yale, you start to become a little bit culturally alienated from the home that you grew up around. But I do think it's possible to maintain your roots and to maintain some connection to where you came from. It just requires a little bit of conscientiousness.
One thing missing from your book is pictures, photos.
Yeah.
Why no photos, and are there any available?
There are some available. I'm actually working on getting a website up so that people can see some of the characters that they read about in the book. It's definitely something that just didn't come up. I wonder why, in hindsight, we didn't decide to stick a few photos in. Maybe my fault, maybe just somebody who didn't think that maybe, you know, people would want to see these photos. But I definitely regret it in hindsight because people identify so strongly with some of these characters, especially with Mamaw, that I wish they knew what she looked like. But it's definitely something that I'm working on. So people who are fans of the book, please hang in there because I'd like to get some photos up on a website soon.
What's hillbilly justice?
So hillbilly justice is, a sense that there are certain wrongs in the world, but it's a combination with vigilantism. It's this feeling that you don't need the law to snuff those things out. A lot of times you should take care of business yourself. So my grandma told me this story of a man who was accused of sexually assaulting a young woman back in Jackson, and they found him face down in a local river with 16 bullet holes in his back. And, you know, the local paper the next day, it ran a very short story. It said, "Man found dead, foul play expected." With 16 bullet holes in your back, you certainly expect that foul play had some role to play in it. And Mamaw would always laugh at that story. She wasn't bothered by it at all. She said, foul play expected, absolutely. Bloody breath had got to him. You know, that's what you do when somebody wrongs your family. You take care of it yourself. And that obviously creates certain pressures, but it's something that we were proud of in a lot of ways.
What's the story of your Mamaw at age 12 coming close to killing somebody?
Yeah, there was somebody who was trying to steal the family's cow. This is, you know, a family legend I've heard reported to me a couple of times. Trying to steal a family's cow. Mamaw went outside, saw this happening in progress, and went and grabbed a rifle and shot one of the men who was trying to steal the family cow. Now, the other man drove away, leaving his comrade, you know, bleeding and this family's farm, and Mamaw went up to him and wanted to finish the guy off, wanted to raise the rifle at point-blank range and kill the guy. And her older brother impressed upon her that she shouldn't do that, that they, you know, should let the man, you know, face whatever legal consequences he was going to face. But Mamaw felt so passionately that it was wrong for the poor to steal from one another. She felt that it was the ultimate moral sin, and this guy had committed it, and she, even at 12 years old, wasn't afraid to take care of it herself.
You say that Mamaw was a violent non-drunk and Papa was a violent drunk. Or a nonviolent drunk, I guess. Who was the violent one among the grandparents?
Well, I think both of them could be violent. The Mamaw was certainly more violent than Papaw. There's the very famous and very troubling story of my grandpa, had gotten drunk, and Mamaw said, "Look, if you ever come home drunk again, I'm going to kill you." And a couple weeks later, he came home drunk again, passed out on the couch, and she went and poured some gasoline on him and set him on fire. And luckily, one of my aunt sprang into action, prevented him from suffering any serious consequences. He escaped with mild burns. But it really goes to show that Mamaw was not the take it laying down sort of type. And I think that exacerbated probably the violence in the home. It made things maybe a little bit worse. It's funny or troubling, depending on your perspective. I was talking with my mom about that story, and she said, "JD, you really got one of the details wrong in that story." And I thought, "Oh no, there's a mistake in my book. It's the worst thing imaginable." She said, "As I remember it, it wasn't gasoline, it was lighter fluid." And I thought, well, that's a detail that I'm okay with messing up if I mess it up, because it, obviously doesn't change the nature of the story, but it just goes to show how, that stuff like that really happened in their home. It really was a chaotic place for a kid to grow up.
Now, you talk about your sister Lindsay being very attractive.
Mm-hmm.
Where did she get that in the family? And is that your mother? Is that your grandmother? Or, do you know?
Well, I think, I think a lot of the women in our family are beautiful. And if you look at old photos of my grandma, even in her heyday, we like to say, she was a stunner. She really was beautiful. And I think Lindsay probably got it from all sides, from her mom's side and from her dad's side, that she was just this beautiful young girl. And I really, again, it goes back to this family honor and family pride. I was very proud of her for not just being a good person and being smart, but also the fact that I felt she was very beautiful.
How much education do the people of Middletown or of Jackson in your family have?
So I'm the only person to get a 4-year degree, though I guess, my uncle, I believe he got a 4-year degree, but, later in life after he had, he went to an adult education class and got a 4-year degree. That's Uncle Jimmy. Yeah, so he and I are the only ones with any significant college education. I believe my mom may have an associate's degree in nursing. I'm the only person that I know, even, going down to like third and fourth cousins, who has a graduate degree.
So when did you first get the idea to write this book?
So first got the idea to write the book as a third-year law student. And I was really bothered by this question of why there weren't more kids like me at Yale Law School, why I was one of the few poor kids, but certainly maybe the only working white poor kid with connection to this region of the country. I was just wondering, why is it? Why is it that I'm so unique here? Why aren't there more kids like me? And I wanted to ask that question and answer it, and that's really what the book is about.
What did you do about it?
Well, what did I do about...
You say you want to write a book. How did you... this is published by Harper.
Sure.
And it's number 2 on the bestseller list, and I just didn't...
Well, it's funny. It actually did come together in a really serendipitous way, in a way that I didn't expect to happen. So what happened is that I had a professor. Her name was Amy Chua, and she's an author of a couple of pretty famous books. And she said, JD, this is a really interesting story. You're making some really interesting arguments. You should think about publishing a book. I said, whatever, I'll think about it, right? I'll just write it and just not worry about whether it's ever going to get published. And a few months later, I was still in law school. She connected me with some friends of hers in the publishing industry, and one thing led to another. And I had a book deal. And that's really, that's how it happened, is that, she connected me with the right people. Those people made sure I got a book deal, and those people made sure that I was able to publish the book and hopefully publish it well. Obviously, things have gone pretty well so far.
Just for context purposes, Amy Chua sat there several years ago, talked about her book, an international book, and then she was the author of the Tiger Mom book that was so successful.
Mm-hmm.
When you showed up at Yale, you were counting on spending a couple $100,000 for your law degree. Mm-hmm. What happened?
Well, I got a letter from the financial aid office, and they said that I was getting tens of thousands of dollars in need-based aid, which just means grants for the kids who aren't especially wealthy. And I received the maximum amount in need-based aid because I was one of the poor kids in my class. And as I told my aunt, it was the first time that being poor had ever paid so well. But it goes to show that these really elite universities try pretty hard to attract poor kids. They offer them generous financial aid. They go and send recruiters to these places. It's just hard to pierce that expectation that I had, even as a relatively well-educated guy who had already gotten into Yale Law School. I had no idea that it would be so cheap for me to go there. I expected I'd have to take a $200,000 law school loan, but at the end of the day, I probably incurred less debt than a lot of my peers just because I came from a family that didn't have a lot of money.
How many jobs did you have to have when you went to Ohio State?
So it oscillated. So I had a couple of jobs at one point. I had 3 jobs at one point. I just really didn't want to incur a whole lot of debt. And this was before the newer, more generous GI Bill. And tuition was pretty expensive. Living expenses were pretty expensive. And I wanted to have spending money because in the Marine Corps, I'd sort of gotten used to not worrying about money, and I really liked it. I liked not worrying about whether I'd be able to go out and have a beer with friends. And so I worked a lot. And I had jobs that I was all, really lucky to have. They were rewarding and interesting, but it was hard. You end up working that much. You don't have as much time to spend on your studies. Certainly don't have as much time to spend on sleeping.
What was your grade point average out of Ohio State?
It was around 4.0. I did really well at Ohio State. I really I learned the lessons of the Marine Corps well.
It.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely did very well at Ohio State and tried. I realized, partially thanks to the Marine Corps, partially thanks to my grandparents, that was my one shot. Like, I couldn't mess it up. If I wanted to go to a good law school, if I wanted to have good opportunities, I needed to do really well at Ohio State. So, yeah, I studied hard, and I did very well there. It's funny.
4.0.
It was maybe a 3.95. It was. I don't remember perfectly, but I remember maybe I got 1B the entire time I was there.
How did you get into Yale Law School?
A combination of luck and maybe a good LSAT score. If you want to go to law school, you have to take this thing called the Law School Admissions Test, which people abbreviate and call the LSAT. And I did well enough on that test. I had good grades at Ohio State. Maybe the admissions committee just saw something, maybe the Marine Corps background that they liked in me, but I really had no idea. When I first applied to law schools, I didn't even apply to Yale, I didn't apply to Harvard, because I thought there was no chance that I would get in. I only applied to those places on the encouragement of a friend.
Quote, this is you, I am a Hill person.
Yes.
Still?
Still. When I think of what a Hill person is, I think it's about humility. It's about loving the land and where you came from. And most of all, it's this recognition that the value of someone isn't in the credentials that they have. It isn't in the job that they have. It's not in how much money they make. It's in how they treat the people around them. And that's one value of being a Hill person that I hopefully will never let go of, because it's really important, and I like to think it served me pretty well.
What was the story of you riding with your mother in a car? You got out of the car, you ran away. What's that? Put that into context.
Yeah, so I was with my mom after something bad had happened, because I remember that she was very apologetic and asked me to go and take a ride with her. Said we'd have a really fun day. Well, she lost her temper. She sped the car up very fast, and she told me that she was going to crash the car and kill us both. And I obviously was pretty scared. I was maybe 11 or 12, and so what I did, for reasons I don't totally understand looking back, but I took off my seatbelt and hopped in the back car. I thought I'd be safer there maybe. And so she pulled over the car, and as soon as she pulled over the car, I took my opportunity and bolted. And I remember we were in a pretty rural part of Ohio, because I ran through a field and eventually got to a house and asked a woman to call the police. And she did. She called the police, and the police came, and about the time that they came, Mom had located this house, and she was arrested. And that was obviously traumatic to see her get arrested. It was traumatic to have that experience in the first place. And maybe the worst part of that whole experience is that invited the state, the child welfare bureaucracy, social services, that invited them into our lives in a way that was very uncomfortable, and that ultimately I regretted a great deal.
So anybody in your life not like this book?
Anybody in my life not like it? No one that I know personally has told me that they don't like the book. I think everybody, the folks from Eastern Kentucky or from Southern Ohio, they recognize both the good and the bad in this book, in their own families and sometimes in themselves. And so what I've been really grateful for and what I've really appreciated is the folks who've said, thank you for portraying us in a positive but an honest light, for being honest about the problems but also being compassionate about them. And so it really reinforces my belief that there is a real hope that we can talk about these problems openly in our community, like I said, in the hopes that eventually we'll be able to change directions and make things a little bit better.
Quote from you: "Sometimes I view members of the elite with an almost primal scorn. Recently, an acquaintance used the word confabulate in a sentence, and I just wanted to scream. What do you consider to be elite?"
Well, what I consider to be elite is, one, a cultural disposition. So typically you're eating at certain restaurants, you're reading certain books, you have certain habits, you vacation in certain places. Obviously there's an element of wealth to it, there's an element of income, and there's an element of elite credentials, right? And the last thing I'll say is that there's an important part of geography. So if I could sum up the elites, it's people with good credentials, good jobs, who live in areas of the world that are disconnected from the people that I grew up around.
So how do you view government?
Well, pretty complicated, right? So I'm, a relatively conservative guy. I believe that government has a role to play in addressing some of these problems. I'm not the sort of guy who thinks that, we should do away with all government assistance to the poor. But I also, respect and understand that government activity can both harm some of these communities, it can create negative incentives that have to be overcome on the one hand, and two, that it can also try to address problems without really appreciating and understanding the nature of the problem. And so, I'd like to see government think a little bit harder about how we can teach lower income parents how to interact with their children a little bit better. That's not something that's talked about a lot because we tend to think of these problems in terms of economics and income. But, I view the government maybe suspiciously, but ultimately as an entity that has to have some role in addressing these problems.
Have you been back to Middletown High School to talk about your life in this book?
I have not since the book has come out, though I've actually had some contact with administrators at the school and hope that I'll get to go back soon.
So what would you tell a young person that's had the same experience you've had? How do you get out? How do you get to Ohio State? How do you get to Yale Law School?
Well, what I would tell them, first of all, is that they have to strike a really delicate balance, and it's one that's hard to strike, and here's what it is. You got to recognize that life is unfair in a lot of ways. You have to see it. Your community will teach you that life is unfair in a lot of different ways, but you have to see that unfairness and also recognize that with hard work and support from your family that you can overcome it. And so what I always tell kids who grow up in circumstances similar to mine is never give in to the self-defeating attitude that you have no control. Life isn't fair, but that doesn't mean you can totally give up on yourself, because that's just the worst of all possible worlds. But how do you get to Yale? How do you get to how do you get to have a nice job and all of those things? At the end of the day, what you need to do is work really hard. You need to find people, you need to find mentors who are going to support you and guide you through certain unfamiliar territories and unfamiliar networks. But you have to be lucky in some ways, and that's one of the things I try to impress upon people in the book, is that this isn't a problem that can be solved entirely by personal agency. I'm not an up from my bootstraps kind of guy. I'm not the kind of guy who said, I'm going to work hard and make it, and I went ahead and did it. I had a lot of help along the way, and what I hope is that we can think constructively about how to give more kids the same sorts of assistance that I had.
You have a chapter about your wife. Where did you meet her?
So I met my wife in law school. She is from California, is the daughter of South Asian immigrants, so culturally is about as different for me as could be. But what I loved about her is that I saw so many of the same values that I admired in Hill people in her and her family, that certain industriousness, a love of country, a faith in hard work, and most of all just a recognition that it's not what kind of job you have or where you went to school that gives you value. It's how you treat people. And so I really fit into her family pretty well.
Where is her family originally from?
So they're from India.
You wrote, for my entire life, I'd harbored resentment at the world. I was mad at my mother and father, Mad that I rode the bus to school while other kids caught rides with friends. Mad that my clothes didn't come from Abercrombie. Mad that my grandfather died. Mad that we lived in a small house. That resentment didn't vanish in an instant, but as I stood and surveyed the mass of children of a war-torn nation, their school without running water, and the overjoyed boy who you had given an eraser to, began to appreciate how lucky I was. What's the eraser story?
Yeah, so the eraser story is I was in Iraq, so I enlisted in the Marine Corps, spent 7 months in Iraq. And during a mission where we went to go do some assistance to a local school, I remember we were given some school supplies to pass out to the local kids, and I gave this eraser to a boy, and he grabbed it from me and smiled so big and held it aloft like a trophy and ran back to his family. And I remember thinking, looking around this kid's environment at his life, that he had it a lot worse than I had. And when you grow up in an environment, in a community like I did, it's very easy to believe that the deck is stacked against you. It's very easy to be resentful at all the advantages that you don't have. And in that moment, I realized, man, I'm actually pretty lucky, and I should maybe start living like I appreciate all the good things my grandparents did for me instead of being resentful at all the things I didn't have growing up.
With books like this that are so successful on the bestseller list, something triggers it. What was it?
Well, I think maybe Donald Trump may have helped things a little bit. There was, I think, this broad recognition that people want to understand this group of voters who are disproportionately going for him.
Yeah, but who inside the media world or wherever triggered the interest in this book?
Yeah, I think that the best help that I got was from Rod Dreher at the American Conservative, who since he published first a very kind review of the book in his magazine, and then published a long interview that I did on his blog. And really gave me a sense to articulate what I think are the most important lessons from the book, that poverty and inequality are both structural but also cultural problems.
How did you know him?
I didn't know him at all. He was passed the book by a friend. He really liked the book. He blogged about it first, and then wrote a review, and then reached out to me about an interview.
How many printings have you had of the book?
I think there are about 250,000 or so in print right now.
How many did they print originally when they,
10,000.
And how soon did they know at the publisher that they had a hit here and they had to go back and print it again?
I don't know exactly when they knew it, but it was right after the interview was published on the American Conservative, where we all realized that the demand for the book was maybe greater than we had thought it was going to be. And so they went after, second and third printing sort of right away, and it was off to the races from there.
Any intention to write another book someday?
No intention, but I didn't intend to write this one when I wrote it, so never say never.
What's the most significant change it's done to you in your life?
The most significant change is that I have a lot of strangers who know a lot about me, and I didn't necessarily want them to. I'm a very private person, and I don't like telling these very personal stories. In a lot of ways, it's kind of awkward for me to know that other people know so much about me. But I think the response to the book has sort of justified my willingness, my ultimate, forthrightness about my own personal history.
A lot of people like you say, I'm a private person. How can you call yourself a private person and write all of this stuff about your family?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I say I'm a private person is just I was so uncomfortable with it, and I didn't want to do it, and I had to be pushed to be more honest and more forthright.
Who pushed you?
My wife, my publisher, my agent, everybody really pushed me. They recognized that there was more story to tell, and that I just had to go out and tell it. Ultimately, the bargain I struck with myself is that I thought that the book would help explain a problem that needed to be explained. And if the price of it is that I had to give up a little bit of privacy, then I thought, well, maybe it's worth it.
One last quick question.
Sure.
In Jackson, Kentucky, and in Middletown, Ohio, all white population?
Not all white. Jackson, Kentucky is probably above 98 or 99% white. Middletown's probably 87, 88% white. So definitely disproportionately white, working class, but not all white.
By the way, the picture on the cover of your book, the book is called Hillbilly Elegy, comes from where?
I don't know, actually. So it's a stock image that the publisher used to, I think it's a Getty image that the publisher used to put together the book cover. So I don't know where it's exactly from. My guess, just looking at it's from Western North Carolina.
J.D. Vance, author of Hillbilly Elegy, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
free transcripts, or to give us your comments about this program, visit us at qanda.org. Q&A programs are also available as C-SPAN podcasts.
If you liked this Q&A program with J.D. Vance, then here are some others you might enjoy. Author Nancy Eisenberg on her book, White Trash, which takes a historical look at the U.S. class system. There's also former NYPD Deputy Inspector Corey Pegues, who writes about his experiences in law enforcement in the memoir, Once a Cop. And Tea Party Patriots president and co-founder Jenny Beth Martin talks about the Tea Party movement and its grassroots work around the country. You can find those interviews online at cspan.org.